want to welcome everybody to the evening. My name is Liz Vizza, and I'm president of Friends of the Public Garden. We work with the city to care for the Boston Common, the public garden, and Commonwealth Avenue Mall. And we have just over 200 people signed up for this event, which is so exciting. As you saw in the slide, you come from every neighborhood of Boston. And I just have some statistics here, which is very inspiring to hear as well. You are connected to over 80 green spaces, including 32 parks, 4 greenways, 6 urban wilds, 13 state parks and systems, 4 community gardens, and 25 other spaces, including zoos, urban forests and farms, bike paths, and harbor islands, which is just terrific. Boston Park Advocates' mission is to elevate the status of parks in the public dialogue, particularly among public officials. As a network, we work to connect people who care for and care about our parks and other green spaces, and to reach beyond the confines of our individual parks and neighborhoods to join in common cause for Boston's green space, both city space and state space. Half of our green space is state-owned land in Boston. We have 575 subscribers to our email list. Please let everyone know in your world to sign up and to learn about what we're doing, to get e-news, Google group information. You can post information about your green space on that. You also know that we are a network and not a 501c3. We operate in a shoestring, and we really welcome support. So there will be a link to support in the chat. You can go to our website, and we really need and welcome the support of all of the people that are advocates in the city for green space. On that note, I want to thank the Solomon Foundation, who has supported us for years. It's been really wonderful to have your support. They supported us this year and for this event. And Allison Burson from the foundation is here. So Allison, welcome. So glad you could be with us. We have a couple of elected and officials that I want to make note of. Representative Lori Ehrlich is here and hopefully has come into the room by now. City Councilor Michael Flaherty, and Andrew Bettinelli, who is Chief of Staff for Senator Will Brownsberger. So we welcome all of you. We know that healthy parks make a healthy and vibrant city, and we all realize more than any year in our lifetime that 2020 made this so clear and present to all of us. As every piece of civic infrastructure shut down, our parks were free, open, and available to all of us for physical, mental, and emotional health and support during a very stressful year. So what we do is really important. On that note, we are focusing on the major topic of the night and giving plenty of time for question and answer. You had a lot of questions and posed a lot of issues in the RSVP that you sent back. Thank you so much for that. We're going to be focusing another gathering very soon, so stay tuned for that, to come together to network and to address how our parks are dealing during COVID. So stay tuned for that. But now we're going to turn to green infrastructure, climate resilience block by block. How are advocates and agencies working to create a more resilient Boston? We have 2 wonderful guests from the city to talk about the work they are doing to strengthen the city's resilience through our system of green space and leverage that for economic and workforce development as well as green space enhancement. City Councilor Kenzie Bok represents District 8, which includes Back Bay, Beacon Hill, Fenway, Kenmore, Mission Hill, and West End. And I'm thrilled to be working with Kenzie on the Common, the Garden, and the Mall, and to have worked before with you on Yes for a Better Boston and helping pass CPA. It was really, I was inspired by you then, and I was thrilled that you ran and won City Council. Another great ally of ours is Chris Cook, and we know him when he was our Parks Commissioner and worked closely with him. He was wonderful support of all of the work that we do throughout the city. And now in his elevated position as Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space, he is doing even more good work and inspiring work in our efforts as a city through Climate Ready Boston to prepare the city for the long-term impacts of climate change. And we have a wonderful guest that's going to be coming to facilitate the conversation and field questions, Dave Queeley. Dave has worked for over 28 years with communities, neighborhoods, funders, and state and federal agencies to build vision, capacity, and constituencies for sustainable cities, neighborhoods, and initiatives. Dave is currently the Director of Eco-Innovation for the Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation and an Associate Boston Park Commissioner. So take a look at the chat, make sure you put questions in there. And without further ado, I am going to take my slides down and put up the presentation for Kenzie to begin. And Kenzie, I will be managing the slides. Well, actually, I just want to do something for a second because I want to put myself out of the picture here while you're in the picture. Let me see if I can do that. There we go. All right, Kenzie. Just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Great, thank you, Liz, and thank you, everyone. I'm really honored to be here with the Boston Parks Advocates. I think parks, I'm a big believer in public spaces, and I think parks are some of the ones closest to our hearts. And as Liz said, they've been so central during the pandemic. And I also think, one of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight is how to think about a whole network of more invisible and smaller pieces of green infrastructure. But I think we have to start with the fact that our parks they're the first piece of green infrastructure that we all come to know and love in the urban environment. And I think that's where our kind of block by block thinking about this is always going to start. So just really grateful for the stewardship of everybody on this call, because as much work as the city does on all these parks, you all put a lot of care into them and are our best advocates for some of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. So for those of you who don't know me, as Liz said, I'm Kenzie Bok. I'm the new District 8 City Councilor. I've been in the job for just over a year, and before that was deeply involved in getting the Community Preservation Act passed. On the council side, I'm the chair of Ways and Means, which is the committee that oversees the budget process. And so what I want to talk about tonight is kind of a proposal for thinking about where we're going in the future to really meet a bunch of the ambitious targets that the city of Boston has laid down when it comes to climate resilience, and to thinking about that in a really concrete way in our city. I'm honored to precede Chief Cook. In some ways, I should be going after him because I think that the idea that I'm sort of suggesting tonight is really a question of how we extend and expand upon a bunch of the work that his department's been doing on a host of fronts. And so this is very much a kind of a friendly suggestion for everyone thinking about leading the city, about where we might go from here in order to really meet an urgent crisis. And I think that in some ways, we all meet tonight virtually instead of in person because of a rolling crisis that we've been in all year due to COVID-19. And it's jointly a public health and an economic crisis. But I think in some ways it's made real for us what damage will be done if we don't really change the trajectory on climate change. And I think actually one of our greatest challenges with climate change has been that the dramatic impact of it on our societies is as great, even greater than what we've seen during COVID-19, but it's stretched out across this time horizon that has sometimes made action difficult. And one of the things I'm really hopeful about is that what we've all experienced, both about what real crisis looks like and also about our abilities to come together and take collective action, are going to inform us and give us a kind of sense of urgency as we go back in this recovery period from COVID and think about taking that collective action in order to meet this other sort of larger, longer time horizon crisis that we're facing. So as the council's chair of Ways and Means, I spent a lot of time in the budget process this last spring talking to the Environment Department and our Office of Economic Development about how we could accelerate and expand our climate resiliency work in the capital budget. And there's really two reasons for that. One is that when we look at all of our climate plans for how to be carbon neutral in Boston and how to mitigate the climate risks of the city, we have really good plans, and then we have to ask, how do we get there from here? And Chief Cook's going to talk about a bunch of the things that the city is putting into place. Sometimes still, though, we don't quite have the timeline worked out for how we're going to accelerate fast enough. And so there's a critical need when we talk about our capital plan, where everything competes with everything else, to think about how to grow the amount of that that's climate focused. Then there's also the fact that we are, as everyone knows, in a recession now because of COVID-19. And when we're in a recession and we see people suffering in our city from unemployment, and we know in particular that this is disproportionately hitting our Black and Brown Bostonians economically, in addition to public health, we want to figure out things to do that are countercyclical, right? Things to do that put people back to work, that give people economic opportunity, and not just for a day, but really help people rebuild careers. Or build careers in the case of our young people. And a city is very hamstrung in how much it can do that is countercyclical, because we're required to have a balanced budget. But we do, because the City of Boston has an excellent AAA credit rating, we do have the ability to bond and think about big future projects in a way that is pretty capacious. And so when we're in an acute economic moment like this, there's a real interest in marrying those two things, right? The need for an economic recovery in the City of Boston, one that is equitable and lifts in particular the people who have been most impacted, and then the need to really confront climate change urgently. So I think that one of the big solutions to this is a city level conservation corps for Boston. And Liz, if you go to the next slide. So there are many examples of conservation corps. If you recognize the name, it's probably from the Civilian Conservation Corps under FDR back in during the New Deal, which is still responsible for planting more than 1 billion trees. I think more than half the trees that have ever been planted in this country, and in deploying a huge number of young people to build and clear trails that we still use. Like I said, build those forests and just create a lot of the core green infrastructure that that frankly we've been using for decades and have never invested in again at the same scale. But there's also recently been a kind of move to think about how we imitate the conservation corps model on a local level. And the model that I'm most interested in is one that hires a diverse group of Bostonians as part of a sort of multi-year program where core members would be mentored and receive job readiness training and educational training and really get into a pipeline to work on municipal capital projects related to climate change. And I think probably the 3 biggest categories here are urban forestry. Chris is going to talk a lot about the city's plan for that, so I won't go into that in detail, but it's the first step is us having an urban forestry plan. The second step is us having a urban forestry plan execution plan. And what the City of Boston really needs to do once it scopes out the situation it's in from an urban forestry perspective is figure out how we get a lot more trees planted and do that a lot more routinely. And that takes people power. And there is a huge need for trained arborists, and there's a lot of scope for potentially really being us turning Boston into a powerhouse for people from our neighborhoods, from our communities, being trained in that kind of work and doing it here and around the region and country. There's green stormwater infrastructure, which is, again, I'll let Chris talk a little bit about that, but it's everything from bioswales to rain gardens to permeable pavers. And we've started in Boston to think sort of development project by development project about places we can ask people to put those in. But we really need to be thinking about it systematically. We've got to be partnering with Boston Water and Sewer. And that is an endeavor that, again, you're creating a demand for a whole bunch of work that's never really been done at scale before in the city. And so one option is that you just kind of contract that out and see who comes. We have historically had a really hard time driving that work towards a local diverse workforce in Boston. And I think here we have the opportunity to think about how are we training our BPS kids? How are we building on existing summer work like what Dave Queeley, who's going to be moderating us, has been doing, and really, again, build a pipeline so that we're doing that workforce development, economic development at the same time as we're just shifting the scale of what we're doing on these fronts in the city. And I should say, I know Liz mentioned urban wilds up at the start. You know, that's also a big piece of green infrastructure, is thinking about, and as is the Parks Department's parcel priority program, and thinking about how we have these little patches of green space that I know so many people here love and care for, how we have more of them, and how we think about them as a network that's actually this like crucial set of lungs for the city. And we could have a lot of young people getting trained in how to care for those and steward them in ways that, that again, would really support them, like infrastructure, the same way we think about a drain in the street, right? These are infrastructure in the same robust way, except they're doing even more for us. So one second, I think I'm going to my next, oh yeah, well, and while I'm on green infrastructure, I just want to say that, you know, Philadelphia is ahead of us a little bit on this. They're doing a bunch of systematic green infrastructure replacement. And although it's one of those things that initially feels kind of expensive and hard to convert to, they're estimating it's going to cost them about 1.2 billion over the next 25 years, as compared to 6 billion to do traditional gray infrastructure. So this is something that saves us money in the long run. And as we all know, as a coastal city like Boston, everything that we do to mitigate the negative effects of climate change saves us a lot of money, and frankly, saves our community in the long run. So I think there's major arguments for investing in it. The third area where you could really use a conservation corps is building retrofits. I think the city of Boston is going to do some pretty exciting things in the near future on the building carbon utilization front. And again, we're going to create a market for building retrofits to make sure that the old buildings that we love are able to be part of contributing to a green city and saving the planet. And I think that there's an opportunity to train up our urban youth to do that work. And buildings, can't stress enough, they're responsible for 71% of the city's emissions. They're just an enormous factor. So would you go, Liz, to the next slide, I think? So this is basically, my proposal is to think about creating a conservation corps that we could have be a pipeline for young people from Boston into these jobs, particularly our Black and brown young people in neighborhoods of the city where we see very high unemployment that's gone up further. And that these are not just kind of one-off jobs, but they're a pathway into a career. It's also an opportunity for us to create something scalable where we could fill, we sometimes have excess capacity in our capital budget just because of the way that project timelines slip. And so if we were aggressively building a core like this and deploying it whenever we possibly could, we could put ourselves in a situation where we're doing anywhere from $50 to $100 million more of climate capital work than we are today every year, just by kind of being nimble on this front and building this collective infrastructure. And I think that that would be a path for us when we think about COVID recovery that links to economic equality and to climate resilience, and frankly, to having a city where the public goods that we treasure are even better taken care of on the other end. I think it's something that there's an opportunity for a lot of synergy. Liz, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so a reference point for this, just so folks can see, there's a bunch of our peer cities who are doing related things. So Philadelphia, like I mentioned, has a major green infrastructure program, which is with a sister kind of nonprofit. The city has a ownership share in, but it's run through a kind of MOU structure, and they agree each year on how much of this green infrastructure work they're going to do. And like I said, they're making real tracks, and they're really training up a workforce that has great jobs prospects ahead for them. And they're just building the capacity. I think today, if we hire somebody to do a green infrastructure project, it's a bespoke thing. We're contracting it out. We're dealing with only a small subset of folks who know how to even do it. So that makes it expensive. And if suddenly there were capacity in the capital budget, we couldn't, like, let's say, for instance, a school that is supposed to be built, there's some issue with the land, and oh no, now it's going to be built next fiscal year instead of this one. So there's a whole school's worth of capital sitting around. Well, today, we don't have the capacity in the Massachusetts market to say, oh, we now want to do 10 times as much green infrastructure as we were planning this year in order to substitute for that unused borrowing capacity. But I think that the city has the capacity to build up a program where we could do that, and where we could take real public ownership over the direction of this labor market in a way that would really give opportunities to a lot of folks who are sometimes locked out of our green revolution. And Philly is probably the best example right now of really doing that. and one that we're going to take full advantage of learning from as we kind of continue this conversation over the coming year. Baltimore is also doing a wood and land restoration economy, creating community green spaces. One of the things I've learned in this process is that in terms of wood, you know, our trees go through a whole life cycle, right? And Baltimore actually tends them from the nursery forward. But a sad fact is that for all the carbon that our trees capture, the instant that you throw them in a wood chipper at the end of their life, you lose a lot of that again. And so thinking about ways that you can be more creative about how you're gonna use wood even at the end of its life is actually an interesting piece of the whole equation and something we can learn from them about. And then lastly, Los Angeles is running a climate corps that is both they have a clean and green program for youth 14 to 18. So it's like our Success Link, which many of the partners on here today participate in. I know Emerald Necklace is here and Speak for the Trees and many others. So LA runs a climate corps program that's sort of for that age group. And then they also run a young adult corps for 18 to 24-year-olds. So it's really much more a pathway into the work of habitat restoration, urban forestry, revitalizing the river, recycling, improving urban parks, including building these bioswales and installing solar-powered irrigation systems. And then they're providing along with that a whole bunch of training and certification. And I just think that I know that when I think about all the parks that are on this call right now, all the people who represent all those parks, again, I think probably this list of things, really thinking about how to green a riverbank, really thinking about how to lay a bioswale, like about how to turn that abandoned lot into a proper urban wild. Those are all things that I bet each of you could make a laundry list for your park. And the city right now just doesn't have the capacity to get to that laundry list. And I think it's not just a nice to have, a lot of these are the must have things. That's why it's important. And that's why it's in the title tonight to talk about this in terms of infrastructure. Like this is core infrastructure for the city and we have to have a plan for getting there. Liz, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, so that's, I wanted to kind of raise that tonight because I know there's a lot of parks advocates on this call. It's the hints in the name. As was referenced in some of the chatter early on, I think everyone knows that we're now going into a mayor's race. I am not a candidate therein. Very happy first year counselor, but I think that as we have, because of that political environment, we're going to be having a conversation all year about the future of the city. And I think we really need to give the Walsh administration credit for the ways that they've thought about the future of the city on this front. And I think we have to be holding every candidate to account for sort of not just what are the targets, but how are we getting there? And how are we building the infrastructure to go to scale? And smart use of our capital budget on this front and is really actually, it's a way to free up some of the pressure on our operating budget for the core maintenance tasks that we're also going to be growing as we grow this infrastructure. It's kind of, you know, nothing gets done that isn't budgeted for, right? Money is a key piece of implementation. And I would just encourage everybody in the year ahead to ask those questions about implementation and really push for a city in which we're treating our parks, our urban wilds, this whole connected system as core infrastructure for the city of Boston for the coming decades. So that's my 2 cents. And again, I just want to thank everybody for having me tonight and Chief Cook for the excellent presentation I know he's about to give. Liz, as ever, and all the advocates on this call, and just to count on me as a resource for the parks community through the budget process, which we'll be having again this spring, and for all these questions about the trajectory of the city's green infrastructure. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kenzie. And Chris, as we tee you up, I just want to make sure everyone knows we're recording this. What's great is that you'll be able to look at it, listen to it later on, and anyone that wasn't able to come, it will be on the Boston Park Advocates website. So here you go, Chris.
Well, thank you so much. And Liz, is this volume okay?
It's great.
All right, terrific. So So my job is to present the effects of climate change without freaking everybody out, right? So the counselor is right. This is something that we need, and I'm going to give you a whole bunch of reasons why we need it. So everyone's familiar with the Climate Ready Boston Initiative, not to be confused with the Carbon Free Boston Initiative. So yes, we have to deal with climate mitigation. Yes, we have to get fossil fuels out of our energy sources, but today I'm really going to focus on adapting to the climate crisis. So if you could advance to the next slide, please. What are we talking about? These are the things that are going to happen, and these are the effects. And a conservation corps, an enhanced youth work system, or perhaps just an enhanced divisions of the Parks Department, or water and sewer, all these other different opportunities would basically be dealing with these things. They would be dealing with heat, they'd be dealing with stormwater flooding, and they would be dealing with flooding. If you move to the next slide, please, I'm going to give you a crystallized example of some of the transformational projects that we're going to need over the next 20, 30, 40 years in order to protect our city. Here you're looking at just a snapshot of the Climate Ready Dorchester plan. And what we're showing here is a contemplation of expanding parkland into the water. This is the unbelievable DCR system that everyone's familiar with that runs contiguous with roads like Morrissey Boulevard and provides us amazing places like Tenian Beach. But we're also aware that these properties flood on a regular basis. So if you advance to the next slide, the vision of this is breaking this up into coastal resilience solution zones, and each solution actually has a bespoke adaptation that will require a very specific set of operations and maintenance that we apply to it. This is a Herculean task, right? And this is the part where I say thank you. I say thank you to all the Boston Parks workers who've been working all throughout this pandemic. I say thank you to all the Department of Conservation and Recreation folks that have been working throughout this pandemic. I thank all the friends groups who have been out taking care of our parks through this, because if it wasn't for the parks, I don't think any of us mentally would have gotten through this. And I would argue that some of us, like myself, haven't mentally got through this very well, but that's okay. We're moving on. But every single one of these solutions is we're going to require another level of maintenance on top of this. So just imagine that. Budgets are already tight right now, okay? And we're going to layer in difficult operations and maintenance on top of those tight budgets. It's going to require more investment. It's going to require intentional partnerships, but we have to find a way to do there, or else our city won't be able to adapt to the climate crisis. Next slide, please. But this is the big benefit of what we get if we can actually figure out that operations and maintenance. So again, this is one of those solutions in that Climate Ready Dorchester plan. It actually enhances parkland that exists. It creates a pathway system that's not there today. It connects two disparate parks that is very difficult for a neighborhood to have a seamless experience of. And oh, by the way, it also protects a major highway and also red line infrastructure, which brings people into our urban core to work every single day. But it has to be taken care of. So we do want to expand park space in the city for all the benefits that we were talking about: flooding, heat, stormwater prevention. But where are we going to find this additional park space? Well, as the councilor mentioned, we are going through a parcel prioritization process right now here in the city. If you move to the next slide, here are some of the results we've actually received. And I would encourage people to still send in your advocacy. If there are parcels in the city that you think should become green space, please let us know. But the reason I'm showing this slide is look at how many people are saying, hey, we need a park or we need green space in our neighborhood to deal with something like flooding, or we need something to deal with the heat in our neighborhood. I mean, these are people who are literally saying, please do the right thing, city. Please plan accordingly, because we're already feeling the effects of the climate crisis today. This isn't 2070 when our neighborhood becomes too hot. This is somebody who's too hot already today and wants to expand green space to deal with that, or whose neighborhood already floods and understands that green space could possibly be a solution to that. If you move to the next slide, please, you can see that the argumentation from the parcel prioritization feedback that we've received shows that there should be an expansion of green space throughout the city. Now, It's perhaps unsurprising that when you ask a bunch of parks advocates if there should be more parks in the city, that you receive a lot of strong feedback that there should be more parks in the city. But what you can see is the reasons that people give. They're around equity issues, they're around climate issues, they're around flooding. These are real things that affect neighborhoods. And green infrastructure, as the councilor said, is one of the most inexpensive ways to actually deal with some of these issues. And some of you know from some of our other work in the Boston Parks Department, we also feel that the expansion of park space is one of the easiest ways to deal with social equity issues. It's very complicated to make a better school. It's a lot of work. It's very complicated to provide health services in a certain neighborhood. It's very complicated to address other issues. But one of the first steps you can do at fomenting strong community and building social equity and really being intentional about an equity framework to decision making is expanding and providing an equity in how you invest in parkland in a neighborhood. It builds community. Now just imagine if that parkland could also take care of people in the climate crisis. If you move to the next slide, you'll see one of the things that I think this conservation corps could really make a dent in, and that's the urban heat island effect in the city of Boston. And as the councilor said, we really think there has to be an expanded tree canopy in the city. Right now, the tree canopy is about 27%. If you move to the next slide, please, you can see that the heat correlates, if you remember that heat map that we just showed, it correlates very strongly to tree canopy in the city. So the well-treed neighborhoods like West Roxbury and Hyde Park, they tend to be cooler over a period of time. As you get to the urban core, especially South Boston and East Boston, those tend to be hotter neighborhoods. Another way of looking at it is on the next slide, if you don't mind advancing it to the next slide. You can see a hexagonal grid by grid comparison between the tree canopy and the heat. And again, the neighborhoods with less trees are just hotter. Well, not only are they just hotter, but they also tend to have worse air quality. And oh, by the way, some of them also happen to be on census tracts for those who are socially vulnerable. And oh, by the way, those also happen to be neighborhoods where there happens to be high asthma rates, neighborhood like Chinatown. So you start layering in these different burdens that we're putting on communities, and you start to say the expansion of green infrastructure is not just an investment that stretches the budget of DCR or stretches the budget of Boston Parks, which, by the way, those budgets should be stretched to begin with. They're doing really good things and we should invest into those different agencies. But you can also see that the expansion, the investment into the budgets of those departments is also an investment in public health. And that's the real benefit to green infrastructure, is you can actually start to move the needle on the public health benefits in the not only the pandemic crisis that we've gone through and the respiratory diseases that we're facing with that, but also the racial equity crisis that we're facing, not only in our city, but also throughout the country. If you move to the next slide, please. You can see I grabbed this snapshot from the Boston Water and Sewer Commission. This is a very, very fun tool. If anyone wants to go to the water and sewer site, you can start to see some of the different green infrastructure that's throughout our city. And it's interesting because what you can do is you could actually start to imagine visiting these sites with a youth group, showing them how the system works, and then bring them out to another site where we actually capitalize an intervention like a bioswale, or perhaps it's a rain garden, or perhaps we're telling them how to actually take care of structural soils for tree pits. And then they could actually learn about it and then implement it and then take care of it moving forward. These are some of the opportunities we have into the city. This summer, we actually employed 188 young people in our Blue Shirts program. And we were able to take them to different rain gardens and talk to them about stormwater management. Some of those young people actually took those lessons that they learned and brought them into their backyards and actually applied it to the actual properties on their own land. And that was very, very exciting for us. But could we be more intentional about this work? Could we get citywide? And could we actually look again at those census tracts, look at those heat island hexagons, those places where people could most benefit from green infrastructure, and could we put our kids to work in those neighborhoods so that we're actually starting to deal with some of those social equity issues, but we're also starting to deal with those public health issues. If you move to the next slide, please. I show this slide because I want to remind everyone that green infrastructure can be super fun, right? So not only are these kids going to be put to work to try to save the actual earth and to make a really positive impact, but they could also have a really great experience while doing it. There'll be an open space, you know, such as our Mayor's Mural Crew here in Franklin Park, or perhaps some of the green infrastructure could have an arts and cultural component too, right? So that we can make impacts even further into some of these green spaces. And those are some of the opportunities. And then the last image, if you move to the next slide, please. I just wanted to show you some of the examples that we have at the Boston Parks Department, and certainly the DCR, as well as folks like the Greenway. They have far more examples than us, but these are just some of the properties that we have. You know, we have a property in the South End that has a permeable basketball court. In Bay Village, you have Elliott Norton Park on the East Boston Greenway. If it wasn't for the volunteers of the East Boston Greenway and the people who fought for the Greenway, we wouldn't have this stormwater management system over there. Bioswales in West Roxbury, and then you can see a community build out of the East Boston Greenway rain garden in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. These are some of the opportunities we have to expand on the existing models that we have, but the councilor is absolutely right. It will require investment, and it is not cheap, but you get huge dividends from it. And I would just caution us to think that the dividends themselves are just on those, the climate effects or just the actual management itself. There's other dividends, and it's certainly the workforce development side of it, and it's the building community side of it. And with that, I'll close my remarks because I know it's time for discussion. Good call out, Marianne Welch Greenway. Thanks, Karen.
Okay. Thanks, Councilor Bok and Chief Cook. We've got a ton of questions, and so I'll get started. It'll take us a little while to get through them all, but I was really thrilled. Thank you for talking about your focus on green infrastructure and its connection to public health, reducing pandemic issues, improving racial equity, and improving social equity. You were just talking about money, so I'll start off with questions about funding and money. And for either of you is, this is more of a general question. How do you see this new decade and this new normal affecting people's usage of green space?
So I think there's a new appreciation, David, but I think appreciation is like everything, it's fleeting, right? And so, yes, there is a moment for parks that people are greatly appreciative that they had it throughout this pandemic, but we have to understand the society and the culture that we live in. That doesn't mean that now all of a sudden, every voter is going to be a Boston Parks voter, right? So the role of Boston Parks advocate is still going to be just as important, because when it comes down to the nickels and dimes and where we actually allocate stuff, I actually think you're going to need a really, really strong advocacy component to continue it. But is there a new appreciation? Of course there is. And part of that appreciation is the role, the outsized role that parks can play in climate adaptation.
And I'll just add to that. I think that I think Chief Cook's exactly right. I think that my hope is that people, having seen how central parks are to our life in a situation like this, will affect kind of planning, right? So I think obviously the city is talking about prioritizing new parcels to acquire. I'm hopeful that an impact will be when we're talking about, developing former industrial lots into, housing and office space and stuff, that people for a while now are going to speak up and say, and a park, right? Which I know, many of us regret not having more of that in the Seaport. And so I think that's definitely a hope of mine. But I think that, to Chris's point, it's not to be a downer, but while we've been sitting on this Zoom, the governor has vetoed the climate bill. And the governor has vetoed the climate bill because, despite the fact that climate adaptation and reducing carbon emissions has both medium and long-term hugely positive economic and cultural and social effects, it often has short-term costs, right? And short-term costs for certain actors. And that, despite the fact that I think we've ended up with more rhetorical consensus in a state like Massachusetts around the need to act on climate, when those short-term dollars and cents get added up, sometimes people still just say no. And you know, that's, I think, what happened in terms of certain segments of the business community advocating with the governor to veto this bill, as he just did. And the only thing for that no is for those of us who care about this to meet it with a stronger yes.
Yeah, it sounds like it's time to double down. I was really disappointed to hear that he vetoed that bill. I was hoping for some good news tonight. Just sticking in the funding question, another question from Erna Shamyon Smith from Mattapan, the Ponset River Greenway advocate. In what ways are Boston's corporate and institutional stakeholders being actively recruited or required to contribute to environmental resilience? That's for either of you.
Well, they're not outside of the development process. And so maybe that's an opportunity for us, right? And so I think there's a philanthropic cultivation opportunity there, but there's also potentially a few avenues that other cities have approached. One is something as simple as a stormwater fee, right? And so this would apply directly to large scale property owners. And, you know, it's a pretty basic concept. The more non-permeable area you have in the city, the more you would actually have to contribute to something to offset the impacts of that infiltration not taking place. So you would imagine that there would be some large scale property owners that would be assessed at a higher level. There's huge equity issues associated with that because, as the councilor knows from her previous life, some of the largest property owners as far as land mass in the city are nonprofits. Some of those nonprofits are affordable housing nonprofits. So you'd have to work out a system. But when you're talking about green infrastructure, that's probably a model that has worked in other cities that may or may not be the right fit for Boston, but certainly something that should be talked about. It. And, you know, it's certainly something that the Water and Sewer Commission has studied.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, you know, I think that we actually have, you know, it's funny, not on this topic, but I filed this week a hearing order because we're going to talk about some amendments that the Boston Groundwater Trust wants to propose to the Groundwater Conservation Overlay District. And I always think in Boston, like the groundwater work, that's something where we all came together and immediately recognized a need. Like, you know, everyone's buildings in a whole bunch of neighborhoods of our city, including most of my district, are at threat if we allow those groundwater levels to be too reduced. And that's something where we ask our institutions, our nonprofit partner, right, everybody to just, when they're building a building, participate in stewarding that shared resource. And so I think one of the pieces, you know, Chris was saying only in the development process, but there's a lot we can do in the development process and with building standards to ask everybody to be part of that. And then I would just say on the Conservation Corps, I think there's a lot of opportunity when you think about certification and training to partner with our educational organizations and ask them to be a really active partner in that, and a partner not just in a way that ends in certification and training, but actually gets people really into jobs.
Yeah, that's always that leap to jobs is always the tricky part.
David, do you know anyone who provides green infrastructure certification?
Do I?
Yeah.
Was that a trick question?
Yes, it was.
Well, you know that I'm teaching. We just had our first class for the National Green Infrastructure Certification Program. So we've been focusing on getting people of color certified. So we just had our first class. We're ramping up for a second one, probably in March, late February or March. And we're also talking to the Center for Watershed Protection about a kind of precursor course that would provide a nice kind of connection between our class and their class and really give people all the skills they need to be job ready. We've also got a partnership with the Mass Clean Energy Center. So we're actually feeding people who have taken our class into their internship program where they get paid to do on-the-job training. We've got a couple of green roof companies that are already interested in our graduates. So we're making the road by walking it a little bit, but we know this field is growing rather quickly now.
So that was the portion of the evening because David is too humble to brag on himself that he's the expert. And if people need to reach out about how to scale up programs to be success and really move the needle on some of the issues we're trying to address, David is the expert.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. Another question from Kelly Bowling, who's the Mass State Director of the Trust for Public Land. How might neighborhood scale nature-based climate resilience interventions and their stewardship be funded if they're not Community Preservation Act eligible?
Chris, you're muted.
Yeah, I was repeating the question so that I could think about it. And there's a couple of different funds that could be accessed in the city, but they don't have a lot. So for instance, in the last city budget, I'm incredibly grateful to Councilor Bok for all her support for the both the environment and the parks budget in the last budget process. We had a climate resiliency fund. And we actually accessed that climate resiliency fund recently for acquisition. The reason we did that is we think more and more there's going to be parcels that become available or they are actually at risk and they're on our parcel prioritization list and we have to access them outside the CPA grant cycle. So we actually use those climate resiliency funds to assist with land expansion of the Rosendale wetlands. And actually DCR funded the other portion of that. So we're incredibly grateful to Jim Montgomery and the state delegation for supporting the other expansion. So between DCR land grants and potentially if that climate resiliency fund continues, there may be some other opportunities. A lot of times, and this is like a terrible thing to say, because it's a lot of money, but a lot of times these properties aren't relatively that expensive. I say relatively because it's land in Boston, which means it's very expensive, right? There's no land in Boston that's, you know, not hundreds of thousands of dollars. But when you're talking about the health and the environmental benefits, those hundreds of thousands of dollars pay dividends immediately. And so they're worthy investments. So there's a few other opportunities, but not many.
Yeah. Okay. And we, I mean, we have done it in Boston's past, but we're not basically making any more land. And so, one of the things about acquisitions, like Chris is saying, is that they can seem expensive in the immediate term, but the nice thing about being a city, about being on the public side, is that you actually can think in decades and centuries, right? And if you think about it, like, if we think about every piece of public land that a public park or a piece of public infrastructure is on now, and that was acquired 100 years ago, there's just no question that we got it for a song, right? And like Boston intends to still be around, in these centuries forward. And so I think it's always good to think about how to use city funds. I actually think this is actually a place where I'm a little bit of a contrarian this way. I think folks are often afraid of and concerned about the history of the BRA, now BPDA, and its powers, but actually there are some powers there related to land acquisition that might be really critical for a program like this. And so, there's also a question of how you think really from the public interest about public powers vis-a-vis land. But I feel like I would be remiss not to say, the city budget's key, CPA is key. Also CPA itself, we grew this year through state advocacy, like the match fund went up. And so that's going to increase what the city's got. But also, again, folks have to advocate at the state level too. I mean, there has been a long running effort, and I know many of the people on this call are involved in it, by the environmental advocacy community to get the state budget to even spend 1% on DCR, and we're not there. So, I think also we've got to recognize, the need for some political work on that front too.
Thank you. Just a reminder for folks to, if you have questions you want to throw in the chat, go ahead. I'm going to go to one chat question from Marie Fukuda. How can we make sure that these needed supports supplement but do not cut into parks funding, especially maintenance and operating funds, which is already difficult to secure in the budget?
Well, I have an idea, but I'll give it to the budget wonk. So.
You can't say that. Then I have to guess what your idea is.
Okay, well, so anyway, my idea is to explicitly segregate the funds, right? And so, we do this in nonprofit management all the time. We have restricted funds, right? And it's just somebody gives for a capital project and you restrict it to that. Somebody gives for a specific program and you restrict those funds to that. And I think there is the possibility to do that through the budgetary process. It requires advocacy, it requires political leadership. The other way to do it is just to have the funds go through a different agency, a different entity altogether, and that's also a possibility.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think Chris is right about segregating the funds and calling out this purpose, and I think that's also about being able to show the long-term savings and the long-term impacts and kind of the cost justification. It's also the reason to really think about ways to do some of this work on the capital budget side of the house, the parts of it that are legitimately capital work, because of the city's opportunity to, as I said, bond and borrow for that piece. And I think it's worth flagging up for folks because some people may have seen this, but it is a little bit on the wonky side of news, and there's been a lot of news lately. The city of Boston had a bond offering back in December, and for the first time, and a lot of credit to Drew Smith, the city treasurer, actually offered a tranche of its general obligation bonds as green bonds because they were funding the pieces of our capital work that were sort of certifiably climate change related green capital work. And the idea there was, maybe there are some investors who really want to invest in green infrastructure stuff. And so it'll make those more attractive. And historically, nobody's really been able to get a pricing benefit from that, actually find that they're more competitive and so people will pay more money to buy them, except that the city of Boston just did that. I think it's the first municipal green bond offering that's actually shown a pricing benefit, and it's significant. And by a pricing benefit, right, I mean so people are paying more to buy these bonds because they're green, which then means that we actually could stretch the same amount of city borrowing to cover more, right? So it creates a real opportunity. If we can keep driving that, we could actually really afford to increase our capital spend on climate related things. So I think that's some very encouraging news for the city.
That's great. You get a big somebody saying that's hot, yay Drew, in the city of Boston. Very cool. So that's good news. So another kind of funding related question from Julie Wormser of the Mystic River Watershed Association. This is for both of you. It's hard to get climate equity without significantly more public investment. Private investment predominantly helps neighborhoods undergoing redevelopment or gentrification. What will lead to a breakthrough in public investment? And you may have already touched on that.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Chris.
It's political will.
Yeah.
There's just, there's choices to be made. But the reason we started, and I started the program with then the deputy director, Ryan Woods, who's now the Parks Commissioner. The reason we started our little nascent Parks First program, and this was a program that we used to go into to advocate for the parks budget, was that we believed, and you all know, because you're all advocates, that parks are one of the first opportunities you have to deal with these other issues within the community. That if you invest in a great green space, you get environmental benefits, you get health benefits, you get social equity benefits, and you can build community through parks investment. That maybe that's a tough sell in some of the other decision-making matrices that people have to, balance budgets with. But I just think, if you have $2 and, $1 gives you multiple returns on different levels, I think it's worth it. But I'm a parks advocate. But it's not a problem that's unique to Boston. It's not a problem that's unique to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's a national problem. I mean, when you look at the budgets for the National Park Service and the miracles that people like Superintendent Creasy do every day, and the miracles that people like, Commissioner Jim Montgomery does every day over at DCR, and what they make actually happen on a day-to-day basis, the public has to demand the investment, not the services. right? That's where we always get confused, because if you continue just to demand the services, you may get that service because you're the squeaky wheel, but it may come from someplace else. The public has to start to demand the investment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I agree with Chief Cook. Political will.
Another question from the chat from Sarah McCammond. With the growing development on the East Boston and South Boston waterfronts, how do we hardscape to a greater tree canopy and green spaces? And could there be, or is there an initiative for city-owned, including BPDA-owned properties, to require green infrastructure that can often be a conflict in development?
No, it's a good point. And it's on the large projects, you know, through the green building review process that we have, we actually accelerate beyond Boston water and sewer standards. And so the GI on site not only deals with the stormwater impacts of the project itself, but we actually try to address some of the issues around the city. The problem is that there's a lot of existing buildings, and then there's a lot of buildings that don't trigger that level of review, that level of interdepartmental review. And so there's a whole ecosystem of buildings, that's a poor choice of words, but there's a whole ecosystem of buildings that actually adversely affect our ecosystem in the aggregate. And so our development review has to start to happen at that community level. Climate Ready Boston is doing that through the heat study that the state was good enough to fund us for. And obviously we're doing that through the tree canopy work, and the parcel prioritization plan does include city-owned parcels in that prioritization plan. So hopefully we can accelerate that.
I'll also just add that I think we have to recognize the fact that one of the drivers of demand for hardscape is parking. And so, you know, that's a conversation that folks have to also have. When we're talking about development, if we want to get rid of hardscape sometimes, get rid of asphalt, it's really about reducing parking minimums. And so, you know, it gets back to that point I made about the veto, right? Like there's some real trade-offs in this world. And the climate crisis is too urgent for us not to face up to and make some of those trade-offs, I think.
So a few questions about trees and canopy, not surprising. One question is, individual homeowners and developers are cutting down healthy, mature trees faster than the city can replace them on public land or in rights of way. How can we slow down this cutting so planting initiatives actually increase our canopy coverage and do so in an equitable way? And that question's from Evan Brinkman of Dorchester, the Ponset Greenway advocate, Shawmut Tunnel Cap advocate, and Reverend Lesh Park advocate.
Yeah, so we're gonna need a tree ordinance that applies to private land. And that's gonna be complicated, but we're gonna have to do it as a city. And the person who's asking the question is absolutely right. The tree canopy loss that we've had, now, so the tree canopy has been stable from 2014 to 2019. It's 27%, both times that we did the LIDAR study. But what that doesn't tell you is it doesn't tell you where the gains have been and where the losses have been. So the gains have actually been in that public right of way because of the really intentional work of Public Works and the Parks Department, and also planting on parks land. The loss has been through private development, and surprisingly, or not surprisingly, the biggest losses have been in the most well-treed sections of our city. So sections of Mattapan, sections of Hyde Park, and sections of West Roxbury. Through the urban forestry master plan, part of the work that the consultant will have to undertake is a technical legal analysis of a ordinance structure that would actually protect trees of a certain caliber, trees of a certain size on private property. Whether they actually stay on site, which would of course would be, you know, our preferred alternative, or if the removal results in, you know, some sort of payment that would actually incentivize planting in the exact neighborhood. The details of that are going to be fairly complicated, and that's controversial. That's controversial in other cities, and you know, it's a taking of private property for public benefit. But it's something we have to do because the tree canopy just gives us so many benefits. We have to protect the urban tree canopy.
Yeah, I think Cambridge has tried something like that, and it's been challenging from what I've heard. So question from Zara Zito in the South End. Chris, this one's for you. Melnia Cass Boulevard, open space and trees are threatened by construction and development. And in partnership with the neighborhood and a land trust, do you think parks would be willing to have land along both sides of Melnia Cass Boulevard transferred to parks to be used for a Lower Roxbury Greenway in partnership with the neighborhood?
So that's what will be under consideration as we're going through the pause of the Melnia Cass project. And so Christopher Osgood, shared with the community last night that we're going to commit to a redesign of the project moving forward, one that will not only achieve the transportation goals but hopefully save as many trees as possible. I do think there's a real conversation to be had as we move forward with that project to look at the opportunities of expanding contiguous green space out there. And then not only just on some of the parcels, but actually some of the expansion of right-of-way that perhaps the city already has control of. So you look at properties like Orchard Gardens, you look at properties like the water and sewer headquarters itself, where are our opportunities right there to provide environmental benefit and a recreational benefit. So that is part of the work ahead of us, and the Environment Department has committed to assisting the Public Works Department in that process.
Someone had another specific question about trees. North Roxbury is predicted to be a real hotspot in the near future. Can more trees be put in front of the police headquarters on the Southwest Corridor Park? Can we put surface parking in mechanized structures, triple the parking, and put green roofs on top of these structures? Is this something the city could work on?
It's something the city has to work on. And the reason why is that the public realm is not going to be the full answer there. There just isn't enough large green space to really move the needle. Some of the sidewalks are very, very complicated. As you can imagine, there's a lot of competing interests in the sidewalks between ADA access, between utilities. We can be more intentional about planting where we can. Green roofs do have to be part of the solution to this problem long term, especially on heat island effect. It's nascent work in the city, it's conceptual work in the city, but we have to start moving towards implementation.
Steve, I'm going to just give you a heads up, maybe one more question and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, all right. Let me pick a good one here for you.
They're all good questions, David.
Yes, you're right. Sorry about that. Well, here's a fun one. Will the city reinstate its Love Your Block programs?
I'm completely stumped. I know what Love Your Block is, but I never knew we got rid of them. So.
Okay.
So I hope so.
I think there might have been a COVID pause, but
I apologize. Okay.
Permanent, yeah. Give us a different last question, David.
Yeah, let me find a different one for you.
But I know that I think those are coming back. I think comfortable to say.
How do you plan to help Bostonians evaluate the danger, i.e. assess their personal risk related to heat, and would hope that everything is on the table from location-based notifications, push to phones, partnerships with the community health clinics, signs at park entrances regarding safe use parameters, et cetera. So.
Councilor, do you want to take that first?
I mean, you can, well, I'll say something and then I'll let Chris close. I think that heat, one of the pernicious things about it is that it's something that we have so much evidence of how it shortens people's lives, but it is this kind of silent killer and silent threat. And I think, as the questioner clearly knows by the framing of the question, a lot of people are unaware of the negative impacts that heat is having on them and their community. And it's just another piece of part of what we've been talking about tonight, right? Is we need to do this really major investment. There are huge benefits, but sometimes those huge benefits are they're still running a little bit under the radar. And then as a result, we get tripped up on the short-term costs. And I think heat is a real example of something where the actual cost of inaction is people's lives. And we see it all the time. And you can literally, you can track deaths in a city and heat waves and just see very strongly the correlation there. And so, so it's something that I think we do need to be much more proactive as a city in getting the word out to people as we also try to, through our green infrastructure, really make a dent in the problem. So I'll pass it to Chris.
No, I think, yeah, and I agree with the counselor 100%. And I also agree with the question itself and the answers provided. I think we treat it like a public health crisis that it is. Heat kills people today. But I will say one thing just on the intervention side. Yes, it's about education. It's about people reducing their exposure, but it's also about the city being incredibly intentional, data informed about where to spend the limited amount of dollars. And I'll give you an example. You know, you could easily put 1,000 new trees into West Roxbury tomorrow, just because there's enough public realm, there's enough sidewalk, there's enough median strips to do it. That may not be as valuable as putting 5 strategic trees in Chinatown, right? There could be a microclimate in Chinatown where those 5 trees could actually provide a somewhat healthier climate for individuals living in housing. And so that's where the rubber hits the road on really making a difference on environmental justice.
Well, I'll stop there. Liz, I know you have some concluding remarks, and sorry we ran over a little bit. Really exciting conversation. I kind of kept going further than I should. So, but thank you all.
We could have gone another hour, Dave. Thank you so much for facilitating an amazing conversation. Thank you, counselors. Thank you, Chief. You know, you really are, I'm going to just say you're a model of what a public servant ought to be. It's been really inspiring and provocative, and we could have gone for another hour. We're saving the chat. There's a lot of questions. You know, maybe I'll ask one last thing, and it may be early to ask, but what is a call to action? I know both of you talked about demanding what we need to demand, and maybe it's too early to say what it is. We're heading into budget season. We've talked to the commissioner about the needs of the Parks Department, and if there's anything you can say now, or you can let us know, we can let the word get out about what the call to action should be.
Well, I'll let the counselor close, but we can't pass up this moment. And I don't want to minimize how horrific this pandemic has been, and it's been absolutely terrible. I mean, people in the city, the Boston Planning and Development Agency at one point, because it paused all its processes, actually got into the business of food distribution in our city. It's been awful. But the moment that Parks has had, we should really capitalize on this moment as a moment to expand. You know, yes, we have 100% of our residents within a 10-minute walk to a park. Why should we stop there? You know, why couldn't it be a 5-minute walk to a park? And why couldn't we have all these environmental benefits that we're talking about? So let's not lose this moment.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and just, I think, and I do think the pandemic's shown us the power of collective action. It's also shown us the failures of when you don't have collective action. Certainly something we've seen on a national level. And I think that surely if there's anything good to come out of it, it has to be that like finding of a sense of urgency for all of us. And so, you know, I think that obviously more concrete budget ask things will come out probably in the coming weeks and months. I do think that the point that Chris made about, about asking that this budget, that it grow for parks, but also that we start to grow that category of climate related spending, and that we mark that, and that we go from, I mean, I think, on the capital budget side, it's been good that the city is committed to 10% of the capital budget is climate related. That's a good benchmark, but it's not a good enough benchmark. And it's not a good enough benchmark because we don't have a guarantee that doing 10% every year is going to get us to where we need to be. In fact, we pretty much know it's not gonna. And so I think that, asking that those benchmarks be connected to where we want to go, and then asking, of your political candidates that people really have on the horizon a multi-year plan for major increases in investment. Both on the maintenance, operating, and capital side, and then also, both for these parks that we count on in our daily life, and for this overall expansion of green infrastructure, some of which is in those parks, and some of which is in this interstitial kind of infrastructure of the city. I think that the people on this call have have a really unusual ability to form a citywide caucus around these issues. I think that we so often in Boston end up, arguing for kind of our parochial, in the sense of, right, literally sort of parish area interests. And I think that that you're so much stronger as a united community advocating for a shift in scale, right? Otherwise, you're always fighting over just kind of like the world as it is now, and how are we going to allocate that? And I think that you've got the moral force of the climate crisis behind you, and I think that we, those of us who are political advocates for this, count on that citizen advocacy. And it's one of the reasons why I think the Boston Parks Advocates just fills this like crucial role, and can really be a catalyst for what has to be the future of the city. So I would just ask you all to claim that destiny, as it were, and to really lean into it, and know that in many ways the city is counting on you to hold all of us to that standard. So I'm just really grateful for you all.
Well, thank you. That is inspiring. It is the reason why we have a Boston Park Advocates, and it really is helpful for you both to remind us why we exist and the work that we need to do, particularly now. Thank you so much, everyone. I told you we are going to be gathering again, talking about your parks during COVID, but we also happen to be having a mayoral race. So we, as we did when our wonderful Mayor Walsh, who's leaving us for DC, was elected, we had mayoral forums. They were incredibly well attended. They were the most well attended forums of any forums in that cycle. The Parks Advocates we were at Franklin Park. We had to have an overflow room and live stream it. I mean, we are a force, as you said, Kenzie, and we will remain that way, and we'll do the work that we need to do together to make sure that we have a healthy future for the city for each of us. So thank you all for coming. As I said, it's recorded. We'll be putting it up on our website, and stay tuned for more great times together. Thank you so much for your time, both of you, and you, Dave. Thanks for facilitating.
Thank you so much.